Good morning to you all, the participants and all the invitees who are present today at the Westin Hotel Jakarta in person. And we are also open for the seminars online via Zoom. So I would like to greet you once again. Good morning. This is very, very early, but I believe that you are here today, as we all are, to celebrate a decade of impact and the launch of United Nations Global Pulse Asia Pacific. So please give a round of applause. Thank you very much. Please let me introduce myself first. I am Aisha Fabian and I am so thrilled to be here again to conduct and be the host for the second day of this event. So yesterday's event and all the seminars went very smoothly, and we cannot wait and looking forward what we have on the plate for today. As tonight also there will be the gala dinner, and it will be the highlight of the event. So this year marks a significant milestone as we celebrate a decade of Pulse Lab Jakarta, and all the milestones can be explored through the interactive exhibition behind you that exhibits the various sectors that Pulse Lab Jakarta has established over the years. And its transition to United Nations Global Pulse Asia Pacific. So today we gathered here for the seminar on Catalyzing Innovation in Asia Pacific through Quintet of Capabilities. Before we move on to the opening remarks, it is our pleasure to welcome the distinguished guests. Please let me say hello to Mr. Kirsten Yower, Deputy Director, Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit Executive, Office of the UN Secretary General, who is joining us today live via Zoom. And then Mr. Faisal Tamrin, Data Innovation and Policy Lead, UN Global Pulse. Ms. Desi Visiana, Government Partnership Coordinating for UN Global Pulse, who will also be the moderator for today. And Ms. Pratishka Singh, Independent Consultant, United Nations Development Program. Ms. Zainab Kakao, Regional Innovation Specialist, United Nations Development Program, Pacific Fiji. And then Ms. Caitlin Court, Senior Advisor, the Behavioral Insight Team from Australia. Good morning. And also good morning for Mr. Jong Gun Lee, Chief Visionary Officer, Enterprise Blockchain. One more, Dr. Karaitiana Tayuru, Maori AI Data and Emerging Technologies Ethicist from Tayuru and Associates, who is also present via Zoom online. Today, to begin our event, we invite Mr. Faisal Tamrin, the Data Innovation and Policy Lead at United Nations Global Pulse, to deliver the opening remarks.
Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi. Allow me to speak in English. So good morning everyone, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Pulse Lab Jakarta, it is with a great pleasure that I welcome you all to the seminar that holds immense significance in driving innovation and development in the Asia Pacific region. Guided by the United Nations Secretary General, our common agenda, today's seminar revolves around the powerful concept of Quintet of Change, which will strengthen and make the UN more effective. Firstly, also, I would like to thank to Mr. Kirsten Yower, the Deputy Director, Strategic Planning and Monitoring from the Executive Office for the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, who is joining us virtually from New York to be the keynote speaker, and all panelists that have kindly joined us here today physically and virtually. Allow me to share some of my personal reflections with you. So my journey with the Pulse Lab Jakarta began in 2013. When I was introduced to the lab data innovation efforts, by one of today's panelists, Mr. Junggun Lee. So I know him long time ago. So he introduced me to how the lab constructs interactive dashboards that demonstrate the possibilities of utilizing social media and other alternative data sets. Then I end up at the end joining the team. Looking back on those years, the concept of harnessing big data, artificial intelligence, the human-centered design for the development and humanitarian purposes, we still very relative new. And as a result, PLJ primarily focused on showcasing the potential solutions that these emerging resources could offer. And today's seminar showcased that how much the landscape has changed as we are today to talk about the Quintet of Change, which encapsulates the 5 fundamental capabilities: innovations, data digital, strategic foresight, and behavioral science. By leveraging these capabilities, we aim to unlock the vast potential of innovation in the Asia-Pacific regions, aligning it with the development effort. And in these sessions today, we have the privilege to uniting experts through leaders and innovators who will shed the light of those concepts and explore their impact through engaging presentation and through provoking panel discussions. Together, we also would like to gain valuable insights into the technological advancement, cross-cultural collaborations, government support and policy, and sustainable development initiatives that are propelling innovation in the region. The discussion today can offer us a glimpse of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. I'm thrilled also to inform you that these events today follow in the hybrid format, allowing participants to choose between attending in person or joining us online. And I extend my gratitude to each and every one of you that joining us today, whether physically or virtually. Let us embrace this unique opportunity to explore the Quintet of Change and chart a path toward a more innovative and prosperous Asia-Pacific region. Thank you and have a wonderful session.
Thank you very much. That was the wonderful speech from Mr. Faisal Tamrin, the Data Innovation and Policy Lead at United Nations Global Pulse. And now, it is a great pleasure that I would like to invite Mr. Kirsten Yower, Deputy Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit Executive Officer of the UN Secretary General, to deliver the keynote speak.
Thank you very much for that incredible introduction. It's a real honor to be with you on this special day as we together as a team start on that new journey to extend the reach of Pulse Lab innovations across the entire Asia-Pacific region. Thank you very much for having me. I want to use this opportunity to reflect together with you on the 3 big issues. First, the urgency for change in sustainable development, why we need new approaches, why we need innovation teams like Global Pulse. And then second, zoom to Indonesia and the tremendous potential for impact in the Asia-Pacific region. And then close it off and look at the change that we can drive together in public and international organizations. Because if we get this right, that journey, then we can serve people and planet better, not just in Asia Pacific, but I believe also much beyond. So let's get started on that journey. And I want to talk a little bit about the SDG's vision for why change is necessary. And on the next slide with the SDG symbol, I want to talk about the need for doing things differently. In many ways, in 2023, we're entering the second half of the 2030 agenda, the second half of that incredibly challenging game. And if we're honest and frank in our assessment, we need to be clear that we're behind. We're off track. We're not winning that game. And let me just illustrate that a little bit for all of us and take a global view. 3 billion of 8 billion people are still excluded from internet access that feels so basic to many of us. 2 billion people still don't have access to healthcare in rural areas. 800 million people will go hungry this year. 700 million people don't have access to electricity, and 130 million girls are excluded from accessing education. Lots to be done differently, but we can change that. Not all of it, but certainly more of it. If we rethink, if we refocus, if we recharge and try to win this game in the second half, because in fact, every game is won in the second half, and it's entirely possible for us to do that as well, if we learn to do a few things differently. And on the next slide, you will see 3 big agendas that inspire our work in the UN family. And Faisal already spoke to the common agenda. The common agenda is our vision for reuniting the world behind the SDGs to turbocharge our efforts and do things differently. And we want to bring in the UN family new methods, new skills to bear, a new culture to bear. And that's what we call UN 2.0. It's an integral part of our common agenda, because we believe in the UN, just like in many other countries, in every public administration, we need to evolve. We live in a world of accelerating change that will require new skills if we want to serve people and planet better. And let me talk about that quintet of change, those 5 skill areas that we believe in combination with stronger cultures can make an incredible difference in the second half of this game. So let's start off on the next slide with the first thing that we need to start learning to help our stakeholders imagine and prepare for a broader range of futures. We live in a time of great uncertainty, but we also live in a time where we have the opportunity to imagine and pursue greener, better, safer futures if we so choose. And all of those journeys start with imagining how we can live differently. So futures and foresight is an incredibly important method that we want to foster together with all of you. On the next slide, we're highlighting the importance of bringing new ideas to bear. And that can be learned. It's called innovation. It's called experimentation, incubation, accelerating new ideas and bringing them to scale. And the Global Pulse team has done tremendous work in that area so that we can work towards better solutions that help us in that challenging game we're all in. Now, on the third slide, there is a note here on a discipline that is new to many. 10 years ago, many of us had not heard of the idea of behavioral science. But today it's mainstream. It's something that is winning Nobel Prizes for academics because they have learned that we can help people make better choices. If we look at how people really act in practice, not just in theory with models, but if we're with them and combine psychology, sociology, economics, and data science in new ways and make better choices, not just online, but also offline. Now, online is the world that we live in. It's a world that is pervaded with data. Data surrounds every aspect of our lives. There is risk there, but there's also incredible opportunity to make progress with the power of data for sustainable development. And Indonesia has been a leader in that area. And the UN family is the steward of some of the most important global data sets. We can do more with that if we learn predictive analytics, if we learn to apply machine learning, artificial intelligence to our work and boost productivities in new ways. And then finally, there's that digital transformation where data is such an incredibly important part, but it extends beyond data. It's thinking through the public stack. It's thinking through digital public infrastructure and the digital commons and fostering them in new ways. These are all things that public sector organizations need to learn. None of that is easy, but it's a journey that we can tackle together. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing in the UN to understand where we're at and to move forward. One thing that our office does and that the Secretary General has instituted is an assessment to understand the baseline, to understand where are UN family organizations today when it comes to their organizational culture and when it comes to their capabilities and skills in that quintet of change. And on that chart, you see that the picture is still mixed. We've looked at over 50 organizations. We've looked at over 300 attributes of change. And what we're seeing is that it's in the data and digital innovation areas where we've made a lot of progress, but it's in foresight and behavioral science that we, just like many other organizations, still have to learn, where we need teams that are moving faster ahead and pull everyone else along. And we know, and you'll see on the next slide, that progress is possible. The dot that was just moving on the screen, I hope, that dot represents the progress we've seen across the UN family just in the space of the last 2 years when it comes to our data capabilities. We've put the power of a Secretary General's strategy behind it. He's championing the topic. He is a humanitarian engineer that is interested in how can data serve people better. And you see progress is possible, bringing data scientists into the organization, engineers, analysts, and applying, for example, machine learning and new forms of analytics. And of course, we can only do that because someone else has already charted a path, and in many instances, that has been Global Pulse. Now, let me conclude this, this section and bring it back home, because that change in UN families is not for its own sake. Ultimately, that change is something we need to pursue to support member states, our member states, the world, in the transformations that everyone still needs to go through. All of those things need learning, and the better we are equipped, the better we can support, and ultimately that is a joint endeavor. Now, just to flag to all of you, in a few weeks' time, the Secretary General will put forward what he calls a policy brief, his vision for how the UN family will change around the quintet of change to turbocharge our support to the SDGs. For those of you who can go online, there's a website already up at un.org/2-0, where you can sign up and be among the first to receive the policy brief that we will put out. Now, let me move on to the next part and talk a little bit about the incredible opportunity in the Asia-Pacific region and why we believe it's just the place to grow the reach of innovation with Global Pulse. Because we can grow and learn together, because we see a unique combination of challenge and opportunity. And on the next slide, we're illustrating some of that, because number one, Asia-Pacific is the world's most dynamic region by many measures. And here on that chart, we're looking at GDP growth that has been more rapid than in virtually all other regions. But much remains to be done to spread that progress evenly, reach everyone, everywhere. On the next slide, we're seeing that Asia-Pacific is not just the fastest growing, but it's also the world's most digital region, with the largest number of people online, tremendous skill sets, but also tremendous opportunities to expand digital access and inclusion together. Now, Indonesia, zooming to Indonesia, we see that we could not have a better base for that endeavor, for that journey, because on that chart, we've just selected one indicator to illustrate that Indonesia is innovative. In fact, Indonesia has climbed faster than virtually many other countries in global innovation rankings over the past decade. So that is a place to start. Now, let me close it off with a few reflections on the potential for change, not just in the UN and in Asia Pacific, but also beyond, and zoom in to Global Pulse. I'm sure many of you know that Global Pulse is the Secretary General's innovation lab. What does that mean? It's a team of pioneers that is working at the intersection of innovation and the human sciences. to inform, to inspire, and to exemplify the change that we need and that we want to serve people and planet better, not just today, but also in futures. Global Pulse has been first in the UN family on many, many, many methods and skills. First to move to cloud computing, first to tackle artificial intelligence, first to run innovation challenges, the first to look into the ethical risks and challenges around innovation and digital change so that we can change responsibly. And over the years, and you see that on the next slide, there's been an expansion in skill sets in Global Pulse, from the data space to the digital, to the innovation, to the behavioral science and foresight space. And I know you've experienced some of that together, because the story of the Pulse Lab Jakarta is rich over 10 years. And just today, I spoke with our Undersecretary General for Policy here in our office. He visited the team a few weeks back, and the impression that he came back with was, this team represents the future of the UN. Let's bring this type of work to more places. And I know you've got an exhibit in the room, and you've had a chance to explore some of the work that the team has been doing. I'm not going to dwell on these incredible advances when it comes to helping people mitigate the impact of natural disasters in new ways, or when we look at the next slide, we're now pushing new boundaries when it comes to using and leveraging private data for public good and learning how to shape and share AI models. We've done a lot of work on foresight together in Jakarta to think through the future of small and medium enterprises, the future of economies in the region. There is tremendous expertise to build on. And now it's about entering a new phase, starting in the second half of that journey, and to really double down on the regional scaling. Indonesia, of course, is an incredible partner to make this happen. Indonesia chairs the ASEAN group of nations. Indonesia is also the co-chair for the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation that brings everyone together, and of course is an incredible champion for South-South cooperation. So we could not be more honored and excited to grow the Pulse Lab together into an Asia-Pacific hub. And on the last slide, let me just say, our focus today is Asia-Pacific, but I'm convinced, we are convinced here in our office, that there is potential for impact across all of the 8,500 places where the UN family serves hundreds of millions of people every day. And I look forward to all the change that you are bringing, not just to the region, but to our work across the globe. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kirsten Yower, Deputy Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit, Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, for joining us and just gave us a keynote speech that is very inspiring. He mentioned about the SDGs of the UN 2.0 and Quintet of Change that we will also be discussing today. But now we will have a group photo. I would like to invite Mr. Faisal Tamrin to come to the stage, and also the esteemed moderator and panelists who joined with us in person and also virtually to the stage. Ms. Desi Visiana, Government Partnership Coordinator, UN Global Pulse. Ms. Caitlin Court, Senior Advisor, the Behavioral Insights Team, Australia. Mr. Jong Gun Lee, Chief Visionary Officer, Enterprise Blockchain. And joining us online, Ms. Pratiksha Singh, Independent Consultant, United Nations Development Program. Ms. Zainab Kakal, Regional Innovation Specialist, United Nations Development Program, Pacific Fiji, and also Dr. Karaitiana Tayuru, Maori AI Data and Emerging Technologies ethicist, Tayuru and Associates. Okay, let's hold the pose so everyone can be on the screen and in frame. On my count, 1, 2, 3. Another one. 1, 2, 3. And if any of you are also planning to post some pictures from today's event, yes, please return to your seat. Thank you very much. You can also tag at Pulse Lab Jakarta. And now I would like to inform that Pulse Lab Jakarta just launched its knowledge repository platform that comprises all its projects and products information that serves as a public inventory. This knowledge repository can be accessed through knowledgehub.pulselabjakarta.org, or you may also scan the barcode that is going to be displayed on the LED panel. Yes, this is it, the Knowledge Hub, and the URL is knowledgehub.pulselabjakarta.org. And continuing our program, we will now be having a panel discussion session. I have the honor to welcome Ms. Desi Visiana, who will be moderating this session. But before that, let me read the brief profile of Ms. Desi Visiana. She is the Government Partnerships Coordinator at UN Global Pulse. She leads the lab's partnerships with Indonesian government counterparts and oversees the adoption of data innovation prototypes within government institutions. She has over 9 years of experience in international development, mostly on the issues around democracy and governance, public sector reforms, open government, civic engagement, transparency, and accountability. So now, please welcome to the stage Ms. Desi Visiana.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the second seminar of our 2 days event, Catalyzing Innovation in Asia Pacific through Quintet of Capabilities. Also welcome to all of you who are joining online through Zoom and YouTube. To kick off, I would like to welcome the 5 panelists who will join me up to the stage today, both virtually and in person. The first 2 panelists, joining all the way from the Pacific, I would like to welcome Pratiksha Singh and Zainab Kakal. Pratiksha Singh is the innovation consultant at the United Nations Development Program and founder of Empathy Designs Consulting, and Zainab Kakal is the regional innovation specialist from UNDP Pacific, Fiji. Hi Pratiksha, hi Zainab. Thank you for joining us today. And then our third panelist who is joining us in person today is Caitlin Court, Senior Advisor at the Behavioral Insight Team Australia. So Caitlin, please make your way up to the stage. Good morning, Caitlin. Thank you for joining us today. And then the fourth panelist, who is also joining in person today, I would like to welcome Jong-Gun Lee, the Chief Visionary Officer from Enterprise Blockchain, which also a Pulse Lab Jakarta alumni. Please give a warm applause for Jong-Gun. our final panelist, who is joining us from overseas, is Dr. Karaitiana Tairu, a Maori AI data and emerging technologies ethicist, who is also part of the Maori Artificial Intelligence Advisory Panel. Hello, Dr. Tairu. Thank you, and welcome to today's session.
Thank you.
So, thank you for all the panelists for joining us, which hopefully will be an exciting discussion this morning. As we just have heard from what Kirsten said earlier, and then as well as the opening remarks by Mas Faisal, we need to boost our efforts across every aspect to actually achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And one way of achieving it is actually through deep diving the Quintet of Change Capabilities as highlighted by the Secretary General in his vision of the UN 2.0, data, digital, innovation, strategic foresight, as well as behavioral science. And on another note, I actually take a note from what Kirsten has shared earlier, that looking across all the regions across the world, a lot of research is actually highlighting about the future is actually lies in the Asia and the Pacific, considering the economic growth, as well as the demography, and then the strong digital uptake in the region. Considering this massive future potential of the Asia-Pacific region, I think it is important for us now to reflect how countries across the region could identify elements for a common agenda for present and future generations to advance sustainable development, especially through innovation. This is why we are joined here today by these wonderful panelists to hear about the different perspectives and how we can harness the power of 5 key capabilities to elevate innovation across the region and to unlock its potential to support development efforts. To start off the discussion today, I would like to invite the first 2 panelists, Pratiksha and Zainab. So Pratiksha and Zainab are both working with UNDP and focusing on the confluence of design research, foresight, and system thinking, as well as experimentation. Pratiksha and Zainab, one of the capabilities is strategic foresight. There was a saying that the future arrives even faster than expected. With what is happening with advancing the region, how can strategic foresight be leveraged for a more future-ready Asia-Pacific? I think we also just learned earlier in the keynote speech that while people have, or countries have starting utilizing data, AI, and innovation, it seems like foresight is not as fast as the other capabilities. Could you please go us through what is actually foresight? And is this something related to forecasting, or is it something different? So I'll give the floors to Pratiksha and Zainab.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So let me maybe, begin first with unpacking what is strategic foresight, like you were asking, Desi, and particularly for participants who may not be as familiar with the field. Foresight is a field of academic study and a field of practice that at its most basic is really a structured and systemic way of using clues about what's changing on the horizon to anticipate what could happen, and using these range of possibilities to really help us better prepare for change. Now, a big part of foresight is also about respecting and understanding what are the forces of the past that have really shaped a system to what it is today, because ultimately that's how it's going to respond to different scenarios. So what I mean by that is, if you take the example of, let's say, the healthcare system, what are all the ways in which something on the horizon could affect the healthcare system in Indonesia might look fundamentally different in how that very same event, possibility, or change could impact the healthcare systems in, say, France or in Fiji. Because how a system has been shaped makes it possibly much more resilient to something, makes it much more susceptible to cracks, or allows it to be more opportunistic and maybe ride the wave and take advantage of that change to come out stronger, right? So it's with this understanding that we as practitioners use different scenarios to play out how something could unfold in the hopes that it helps us prepare and ultimately be able to allow us to create strategies and put them in place today to the degree that we have control, right? With the hope and assumption that we're going to be able to come out stronger if we're able to have strategies in place that can respond or help us prepare to respond to a whole slew of different kinds of possible scenarios if they were to happen in the future, right? So unlike predictions and forecasting, well, let me start with prediction. Unlike prediction, which is really about trying to predict one thing that will happen, the value of foresight is about giving a range of possibilities that we could explore different eventualities with. And forecasting takes some data from the past and extrapolates it to the future without perhaps really giving you the possibility to entertain that different things could happen. I think it's also worth emphasizing at this point that the future, as we all know, is not a singular predetermined destination, right? It's an open space. It's filled with contradiction and alignment that coexists. And while certain narratives about our future will play out, there's probably certain narratives about how our future may play out that seem inevitable, even maybe unquestioned, right? But the reality is that nothing is a given. We are with each day, with each of our choices, laying the foundation for how we're going to be shaping our collective futures. And as has been already said, but really can't be said enough, our region of Asia and the Pacific is incredibly diverse and dynamic. There's no singular way in which events in the future are going to affect us all. And so there's a real need to really practice foresight at a subnational, national, sub-regional, regional, even global level. Because doing this reinforces both our, that despite our diversity, it reinforces just how actually interconnected we all are and just how much our actions directly or indirectly affect each other. And being reminded of that, I think, is really critical because we can't operate in silos. And I think with COVID-19, what we have seen is a real change in the appetite for governments in our region to really embrace anticipatory governance in a new way and acknowledge that quantitative or empirical-based data methods alone may not provide us with the sort of skills or provide us with the ways in which we as governments, or governments can really anticipate and prepare for surprises. And so this is really where strategic foresight comes into play. A big part of strategic foresight is combining the qualitative, the quantitative, in a creative, systemic, and informed way. Applying strategic foresight does require taking risks because you're exploring things that could not unfold. And so at the government level, you can imagine it's quite hard to really justify the spending of public funds in exercises that might not have something to show for it until they do, right? But this is also what puts us at a slight disadvantage compared to the private sector, in that we really have to show where these public funds are being used and how. And even though this is an anticipatory practice, it can be quite hard to justify. But at the same time, our governments, as you can all probably imagine and agree, cannot keep operating in the cycle of constant reactivity, either because we're often, in our region, dealing with many converging issues, not just one. So that said, even though, even while just 2-3 years ago, if you were to ask us for examples, we could only probably speak to governments like South Korea, Singapore, or Malaysia using foresight, we're now seeing a very different wave. We're now seeing examples across Vietnam, Thailand, India, Cambodia, Mongolia, Philippines, and nations in the Pacific. And they're each exploring foresight in different ways. So while the takeaway might not be a uniformity in adoption, I think the signal of change here is that there is a very different landscape of trial and error happening. In Bhutan and Vietnam, we're seeing civil servants and bureaucrats being trained in strategic foresight or in the practice of foresight at large so that they can be ears on the ground picking up emergent changes and engaging with citizens to get real-time feedback and bringing that back to the government to help inform policy decisions. In the Philippines, you're seeing Senate-wide hearings on different topics that have a foresight aspect to them so that senators are informed. And we're seeing different ministries actually building up different internal capabilities to foresight to inform their work. So again, it's not uniform, but we're seeing different ministries do that, and I think that is a start. In Indonesia, of course, you're seeing Bappenas incorporate foresight in one of the methods, as one of the methods in the new capital city planning process. In Thailand, we're starting to see examples of how the government is starting to use foresight alongside other systems thinking tools to really explore how large sectors like tourism, which play such a fundamental role in their current growth model, could be less extractive, could be more equitable, and could fundamentally look differently. In India, we're starting to see different states using foresight as a way to imagine what could they look like 20, 30 years from now? What could they be known for in the coming decades? And how might that inform statewide policy development? There's a lot of power dynamics in foresight because, as you can see, that in imagining what a preferred future might be for a government that it wants to envision and work towards, it begs the question of whose preferred future is being prioritized. And in that lies the opportunity for governments really to use foresight to really speak to and create alliances with its people and better understand what are their current hopes, challenges, aspirations. And this requires a certain amount of openness and a space for contradiction, disagreement, and divergence. And because we are such a diverse region and there's no singular reality, all I can say is that we're probably all intimately aware of the spaces for true open civic dialogue in our own countries, in our own contexts. And if we want strategic foresight to really happen in a way that it informs our policies and that can serve as many people as possible, the single biggest element that I think needs to be nurtured is our space to actually have this kind of open civic dialogue, because foresight at its core is meant to be a participatory practice. And in this way also dispel the notion that only a few privileged, that only a privileged few really have the power to think of or the space to think of and inform our collective futures. And so with that, I want to pass it over to Zainab, who's going to share with you a few examples rooted in the Pacific and really offer us a regional perspective to our conversation. Over to you, Zainab. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Pratiksha, and thanks, Tessie, and the panelists and everyone who's here. Very happy to be here. Unfortunately, we couldn't join in person, but let me see if I can just share some slides. Okay, I think doesn't seem possible, but okay, no worries. I can just speak to a few of the examples. So just building on what Pratiksha was also saying, I think the kind of countries, ministries, departments who are working on foresight have diversified quite a bit in the last couple of years, particularly in the light of COVID-19. And in the Pacific, I want to speak to three examples in terms of the outcomes that have been achieved from the process. And very often we go into the strategic foresight processes with the idea of sort of working very keenly on anticipatory governance, right? Think how can we anticipate things in advance so that we can prepare for them. But the bonus of foresight for us has been the participatory approaches and the outcomes of that particularly, in addition to all the other anticipatory work that we're doing. And the example of that is like Pratiksha was saying, it being rooted in power. I think very often we as UNDP, I think the slides are up. Maybe what we could do is just go to the last slide, the third last slide. It's all right. So I think Pratiksha spoke to some of this, and that's what those slides are about. But anyway, I want to go to the slide which is titled Agency. And I think why this agency slide is the most important, is the one that I want to really share right now in this forum, is because we're realizing that in our work, particularly around accountability, I think it's extremely important for us to use very limited public funds in the best way possible. And we want, as these are public funds, we want people to be involved in the way they are, in the way they are allotted, in the way they're used. So in our work around public finance management, we've used foresight quite a bit to dismantle the power relations, to actually give people a sense of the fact that we are actually being able to, we do have the power in us to hold people accountable. Because you can also imagine in a lot of Pacific nations, and these are small island developing states, very often the geopolitical forces are such that you may feel that you don't have a complete ability to control the future of your country. And that's because of foreign aid, and that's because of there's so many different forces at play. I can see Claire nodding, so she knows what I'm speaking to. But with this challenge, I think it's pretty evident for us that we need to find ways of sort of engaging on agency, so that people actually do feel they have control over their futures, because that's the only way we can act on them. And I think for us, that's been a big gift. I think the second thing that I wanted to speak to was ownership. And I think we've seen that particularly in the case of Vanuatu. Vanuatu, for those who may not know it, is an island nation in the Southern Pacific. And in Vanuatu, we worked with the Ministry of Internal Affairs over the last 3 years. And this was during COVID, and COVID happened in the middle of it. Essentially, there were 13 different ministries which were absorbed in one ministry. And we had to essentially do the planning for the next 5 years. And because like every other Pacific nation, Vanuatu had its own complexity. Foresight became an extremely amazing tool for us to be able to say, how do we actually get each and every department, ministry, community, village to engage with us? And as we started developing this process and we were explaining to them that, okay, this is in line with strategic foresight and, we're institutionalizing it and that's like anticipatory governance, they came back to us and they said, oh, this is very similar to our Nasara. And they explained to us basically their indigenous format of actually doing participatory policy making. And for us, it sort of gives you such a great entry point, right? Like to be able to do work that's real, that speaks to people's sort of indigenous cultures. And the Nasara strategy essentially then became the next 5-year strategy for us. And of course, it builds a sort of like national ownership. The last example I want to speak to is something a bit internal. Again, like I think a lot of the countries we work in are pretty complex. So giving example of Papua New Guinea, in which you have sort of like 800 languages, 1100 dialects, it gives again the ethnic and racial diversity of that country. And in that, actually to come together to say that, hey, we want to do planning for the next 5 years or next 10 years. We worked with different parts of office, different parts of stakeholders, different partners to be able to say, okay, let's get into this discussion around visioning. And the more we spoke to a common vision, the more people saw themselves in it. And that just gives you a rise to a collective which doesn't exist. And very often this collective is an abstract when we talk about it, but we actually don't have a good handle on it. And engaging in these discussions gives people a sense that, okay, if I do this, then I'm actually going to help the other person do that. And without me, this is not possible. An example of that is realizing we can't do peace building work without gender. Like, it's just not possible. Or we can't do gender work without, actually having enterprise development and livelihood. And just the sort of like building the collective on these different pieces of development. So I want to end by saying that as strategic foresight is a great entry point for SDG localization. And I want to take it back to what Kirsten was sharing about saying if you're talking about SDG acceleration, we really need to find a way for us to be able to communicate about the SDGs to our stakeholders. And we found strategic foresight to be one of the most promising tools of our trade to be able to have that conversation. And maybe with this, I'll stop and hand it back to Desi.
Thank you so much, Pratiksha and Zainab, for sharing the informative about how actually foresight could help achieving the sustainable development goals. Now, I think for some of you who haven't been exposed before with the strategic foresight, now understand that foresight is different with the forecasting. It's now looking that the future is not singular because there is different scenario that we need to prepare for something that might happen in the future, as there are a range of possible futures that might happen. So thank you for sharing that. Also the examples that you have given in different countries in the Pacific, that is really useful, and I hope to ask you more questions later on the question and answer session, Pratiksha and Zainab, but I would like to now move a bit to the second capabilities. So I would like to ask now to Caitlin. Now that we have heard the first about strategic foresight, I would like to talk more about the behavioral science. Caitlin has a wealth of experience providing training, capacity building in behavioral insights to government, as well as to organization in the Asia-Pacific region. So with your experience, Caitlin, I would like to ask, could you tell us also a bit about behavioral science? What is it and how we can apply behavioral science to actually drive innovation in the Asia-Pacific?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction, Desi. So as Kirsten said at the start, behavioural science is becoming much more mainstream, and we're seeing its application across the world and, of course, across Asia Pacific more and more. For anyone who is not familiar with behavioural science is a discipline that uses scientific methods to generate findings that explain and predict human behaviour in real life. And applied behavioural science is the application of those findings to address practical issues and challenges. So behavioural science is really a lens that we can apply to any challenge or any issue, and it can complement and enhance other methods and approaches that we use. So typically when we apply behavioural science, we start by identifying a particular behaviour that we're trying to change. We then conduct research to really understand the context of that behaviour. And we then take the understanding of the context as well as principles and findings from behavioural science to design something, often an intervention, to change the behaviour that we're focusing on. And we then typically will iterate and evaluate that change or that intervention to see what impact it actually has on behaviour. So behavioural science, I think, can really drive innovation. So firstly, I wanted to touch on the concept of innovation. I think often when we hear innovation, we think of a light bulb moment. We think of something radical and something new and exciting. But I think that can be a little bit daunting, particularly when we're tasked with being innovative. That can be quite a daunting prospect. But I think that innovation can also involve incremental changes and iterations, and it can also involve taking something from one context and applying it to a different context, and making changes to whatever we've learnt somewhere in one context and really making it relevant to a new context. So we often do this with behavioural science. So when we are designing changes and interventions and implementing them, we're often looking at principles from behavioural science, and we're looking at what has been tried and tested elsewhere and how can we apply that in the particular context that we're looking at. So one example that I can give is the Behavioural Insights team. We were working with BRAC in Bangladesh, and we were looking at how we could encourage people to use hand washing stations, so during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we applied two different sets of interventions. One was quite a low intensity intervention where we installed mirrors at the hand washing station, and we put signs, sort of like pointing hands, going towards the hand washing stations. We then had some higher intensity interventions which involved enumerators at the hand washing stations. They were giving out free soap bars and they were giving out free masks, and we had sort of like a community blackboard that was tracking the use of the hand washing stations. And of course, they were encouraging people to come over and use the hand washing stations. And what we actually found is that the higher intensity intervention did encourage people to use the hand washing station, but only while the enumerators were there at the hand washing stations. So we then took those findings and then we actually worked on a similar project in Indonesia with LPBI NU. And we were, again, trying to encourage people to use hand washing stations still during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we took the findings from Bangladesh, and for this particular project, we worked with community leaders and trained them up in encouraging people to use hand washing stations before entering particular venues. So for example, we worked with religious leaders, gave them sort of a script on how to encourage their community members to use a hand washing station next to their religious institution before they entered their religious institution. So we worked with different types of institutions, so religious institutions, health centres, schools, and really took that finding from Bangladesh that having someone there in person really seemed to make a difference. But we wanted the intervention to be more sustainable, so rather than paying enumerators to stand by a hand washing station, we used community leaders who were already there next to the hand washing stations, and we found that was successful in encouraging people to use the hand washing stations, but in a much more sustainable way. I think that this is, one example of how you can take findings from one particular context and apply it to another. I think this is also a good example of why experimentation is so important and why experimentation often goes hand in hand with innovation. So from the behavioural sciences, we know that people often don't behave in ways that we might initially expect, which is why it is so important for us to experiment and also to evaluate, to see what impact we're actually having on behaviour. Because sometimes we might implement a policy or a program and expect it to have a particular outcome, but it might actually have a completely different outcome on behaviour or a different impact than what we were expecting. So often with behavioural science, we really couple that with experimentation and evaluation. And this can look quite different. The two examples I've given are examples of experimenting in the field in real life settings. But experimentation can also involve rapid testing. So for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we worked with the World Health Organization to do an online rapid trial of posters encouraging preventative behaviours such as hand washing. And we were able to test people's recall of the key messages of posters, their intention to perform behaviours such as hand washing, as well as their sentiment towards the communication materials. So experimentation can look quite different, but can help us to get an insight into the effects of our interventions or our policies and programs on human behaviour. And lastly, I wanted to touch on that in Asia Pacific, we are seeing the application of behavioural science more and more, and we're very keen to continue to see that and to drive that across the Asia Pacific. I think one important way is to make sure that we are sharing findings through events such as these, that we're publishing and reporting on the results of our experimentation so that others can learn and across the Asia Pacific as well as the world. So one example, I was actually just yesterday at UNDP Indonesia, and we were sharing the results of a trial that we just ran on Instagram with the UNDP country offices in Samoa, Solomon Islands and Nepal, who have also been running similar projects applying behavioural science to improve women's access to justice. So very excited to see more and more events such as these, and of course be here today sharing findings as well.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. Give a round of applause for the explanation given by Caitlin. Thank you for giving us a more clear understanding on what is behavioral science and examples how actually behavioral science could drive experimentation and innovation in the Asia Pacific, and giving us the clear examples how in Bangladesh and then next is actually being scaled up or actually also implemented in Indonesia, and how is the context is extremely important, as you mentioned earlier. So that is important to also check the impacts on the behavior, whether that's something that we expected or not. So I would like to also later ask you more questions about it, the challenges that you have found probably when you are experimenting about these different insights in behavior in Asia Pacific. But before that, I would like to move now to our next panelist, who is Jong-gun, who is also close to POSLab Jakarta, as he is the former data science head, if I'm not mistaken, in POSLab Jakarta. He is working in diverse roles across various sectors, including public organization, private firms, and research institutions in the area of data and innovation. So, Jong-gun, I would like to ask the questions, as we have learned from the other panelists about strategic foresight, behavioral science, which is, even though earlier, I think Zainab mentioned that foresight might be a both mix of quantitative and qualitative. I would like to hear more from you about the more quantitative approach, which is data. So could you please share with us what is the potential of data and innovation for development? How can this help address different development issues in the Asia Pacific?
Right. Thank you very much for having me, and again, very grateful to be here. Again, in Jakarta, personally, I arrived in Indonesia 10 years ago to join the POSLab Jakarta as one of initial member, and I would say big congratulations to my colleagues, the UN Global Pulse and POSLab Jakarta. Could you just open the slide? I just prepared some slide which capture some of the potentials of the data innovations for good or development, and also I just wanted to pose some of the questions we are facing to continue the data innovations for development and socials. So this is actually reflecting a number of years of the journey, not only me spending with the POSLab Jakarta, but also spending with the OECD and the private sectors, and I hope that this is opening some of the food for thoughts for you and for the conversation and panel discussions. So while the slide is coming up, we've been there. So, all right. So I can't see the screen here, but can you move on the next slide, please? So just really simple term and explanations, right? So data innovation for goods in a nutshell, I can just define this way. So we are defining or identifying where to apply, right? So it can be described as SDG. And also we need to identify the purpose of use of that innovations or data innovations, such as early warning system or situational informations or raise awareness, for instance. And data innovation by definitions, we are exploring the potential of the data sets, not only about official statistics, but also different kind of the data set that is existing in a society, from the community society or the private sectors, mostly big data. When we talk about the big data, the private sector has been utilizing that information for their purpose. When we wanted to repurpose that information for the public sectors, and approaches can be varied, right? So visualizations and analysis and modeling, etc., etc. So then some of the data innovations have failed, and some of the data innovation can success. So by exploring and by doing a lot, the next slide. So we have been showing a lot of potentials of the data innovation for public goods and developments and humanitarian sections, right? By identifying, for instance, the food security problem, and the identifying the purpose, like the nowcasting, and the big data and official statistics. One of the initial projects we've done within the UN Global Pulse was, nowcasting food prices from the Twitter informations. The Indonesian people love the tweets, all different kind of the informations in online space, where we identify some signals about the food security and food prices and apply some statistical models, and we were able to, the proof that information is very useful to sense about the food price rising or declining in certain areas in Indonesia. And in the following slide, next please. So in the climate change, the El Niños affects a different way in different countries and the regions and globally. And some countries or some regions are suffering from the flooding, or some others, the areas that suffer from the droughts. And we had analyzed the satellite data sets to produce real-time information about that information, but overlaying that once with the official statistics from the Indonesian statistical offices, and also combining with the BNPB, which is the Indonesian Disaster Management Office in Indonesia, producing and overlaying the operational information. And we wanted to help decision makers to have a better understanding, to have a better decision making based on that insight and that information in real time or in near real time. Right, so then the next slide, when it comes to adoptions, we had to prepare all different kind of the things here. Some of the examples includes we had to provide the trainings to the government officials and UN officials. And also we developed some of the SOPs, how to utilize that information in daily basis. In decision making or in communicating with the citizens, SOP or standard operating procedure is another important element to utilize that information. IT hardware is to continue. But that's a part of the adoption process, but in the next slides, but that's not the end, but we realize a lot, that's another start, right? So thinking about, can you go back one slide back? Thinking about the sustainability and scalability, this is another things we need to think about that ones. And oftentimes, what we forgot out of this is, this is all about data ecosystem, where there are different kinds of players. They are pursuing and they are seeking different things. Like the public sectors they are reacting or they are doing something for goods, mandating or based on their missions. While the private sectors, probably they can help one time the governments or international organization to share their data set for humanitarian purpose or the decision-making process. But for them, so collaborating with the governments with only goodwills and good faith is just not enough. Sometimes they need more, right? The research institute, they wanted to produce the scientific papers probably one time as a first actions or first discovery, the people's or organization. But continuing that one is different stories. The next slide. So then, sustainability often requires their continuous contributions and continuous engagement with the data ecosystem partners, while the current format or current way is not just enough for them to do something continuously only with a goodwill, for instance. So moving forward, the next slide, please. So let's think about the SDG 17, right? So we are talking a lot about the PPP and the public and private sector partnership. And I know, and everybody, acknowledge and they know the PPP is important to achieve the SDGs. This up to the 16 or 17s, because governments and international organizations, they are missing a lot of the part, not only just the money, but also other part of collaborations that realize and feel that's the empty part through the PPP. And so far, a lot of the efforts we have been making, but probably we need another form of the PPP implementation. That's what I'm talking, and the finalizing ones. The next slide. The transparency and accountability and the trust and privacy is just the data innovation alone. Those are kind of the components or the element are needed to makes the different kind of the PPPs that produce the sustainability within the data ecosystem. As one example is, the building blocks that is run by the World Food Program, that they are interacting and operating with all different kind of the sectoral partners, the private sectors and community organizations, but also different sectoral areas, right? Sanitations and educations and also the food security and so forth and others. But they were utilizing the blockchains, to ensure that transparency and that accountability, the trust levels, and also, so while preserving everyone's privacy. By doing so, everyone's controlled and had a full ownership of their data set, while they are utilizing their information to interact with the private sectors and public sector and citizen society in all different sectors. And the last slide I prepared today, this is a small initiative I'm working on now in Indonesia and beyond in Southeast Asia, is that, we wanted to give the full ownership of the data sets of the peoples, to the people and to the MSME and SME in Indonesia. Oftentimes during the COVID-19, for instance, they have been working, and having difficulties in working in a certain regular job. And because of that, they often work as gig workers in a platform. And that leads them to difficult to prove and to say these are amount of money I'm earning or the generating revenue in the MSME point of view or individual point of view. And it leads against the limited accessibility to access the financial product and financial institutions in Indonesia, right? So we try to make kind of the fundamentals the platform where the data innovations and the data ecosystem plays their roles whilst the business logic or the business models are in place in a transparent way. So then in returns, gig workers or the MSMEs or financially excluded population and organizations can access better accessibility to the financial product, and also the financial institutions have a better chance to include excluded peoples within their ecosystem. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions and look forward to the discussion with you guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jong-gun. Another round of applause for that informative presentation, how data, small data, big data, thick data can be actually used for advancing development. But again, it doesn't stop there because we don't want just a one-off solution or innovation without any continuity for any sustainability and then scaling up. And it is important, I take note that continuous improvement needs to be considered, as well as talking more about the ecosystem itself, not only about the data. And for the possibility of doing a more holistic in terms of the data ecosystem, then thinking also about the full ownership, for example, as you just recently mentioned on the recent case in Indonesia. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions later in the discussion, but before that, I would like to move to the final panelist, Dr. Karaitiana Tayuru. Dr. Tayuru is the leading authority and highly accomplished visionary Maori technology ethnicist, specializing in Maori rights with AI, Maori data sovereignty and governance with emerging digital technologies and biological sciences. So when Jong-gun recently mentioned about the potential of data and digital innovation such as AI, I immediately also reflected on the yesterday's session when we talk about inclusive data innovation, that innovation should be inclusive, so we are not leaving no one behind. And I think Jong-gun also just recently shared about the ownership of the people who owns the data. Now we are taking a perspective from the AI, Dr. Tayuru. I would like to ask, with the advancement of the AI across the region, how is this actually impacting the indigenous people? What are the risks and the opportunities with AI for Maori and the Pacifica? So the floor is yours, Dr. Tayuru.
Right. Thank you, and thank you everyone who's here today. So I am arguing that AI, while it's very scary for our Indigenous communities, AI can either empower and decolonise Māori and all Indigenous peoples and Pacifica peoples, or we can just ignore it and just let other people tell us how AI will help us. And so we'll remain at a status quo of being marginalised and in the negative statistics of just about everything. So concentrating on the health aspect, in New Zealand, Māori statistically face inequities in the health system. We have biases, we have our people are too scared to go to the hospital, go to see a doctor. So one example of how AI can help is by removing the human when it comes to diagnosing Māori. And then that, as long as the data has been checked and approved in consultation with Māori, we think that there's a huge opportunity to save taxpayers' money or the public money and to help address inequities. We also have a current initiative in the North Island of New Zealand where we have an algorithm. When a patient goes to the hospital, there's an algorithm which works on a number of different points of that patient. And one of them is if that person is Pasifika or Māori, they get a higher rating, more priority to go and see a doctor because historically Māori Pasifika don't get that opportunity to see a doctor. We have AI is already being used in research. So again, Māori are statistically, we're more likely to have arthritis and gout. Traditionally, the medical systems say, well, it's because of your diet. You're overweight. You too much sugar, etc., etc. But research has proven that it's actually it's in our genes. It's not because of diet. So now we have artificial intelligence that actually goes through full human beings' sequenced genome, and it can identify at a better and quicker rate than a human being the mutation within inside a gene which is giving Māori gout arthritis. So there's some immediate impacts that we're using with AI in health. We're already in discussions with social services in New Zealand. Statistically, Māori are more likely to be unemployed, need government assistance, be in the digital divide, require housing. Now, the reasons for this is since 1840, we've had a number of laws that have aimed to culturally assimilate Māori. We've been colonised, but AI has the power to empower Māori for that. So already we have our social services looking at AI to how to remove the bias from the current data sets we have. So, we already know in New Zealand that we have biased data against Māori, and because of the human input. So we are looking at partnerships or data governance, which I understand you heard yesterday. So if we have Māori data governance implemented, look at the data, decolonise the data, we believe that AI will be able to provide social equity for Māori, which in turn provides equity and a better society for all New Zealanders. Using that same social model, where we also believe that the justice system could be empowered to protect Māori rights. So again, we know that there's a human bias that sees Māori more likely to be imprisoned than non-Māori. So we are starting to look at AI using decolonised Māori data with data governance to actually remove the human bias, remove the data bias, and again to empower Māori in the justice system. And just finally, I heard the previous speakers talk about languages. We strongly believe that with the right cooperation with international corporations, that AI could be used to assist the revitalisation and the promotion of our Māori language. Again, this would save billions of dollars of taxpayer or public money in New Zealand, and I argue that we could end up with a lot more Māori language speakers who are a lot more fluent and proficient in the Māori language if we partner with the right artificial intelligence corporations and companies. But to do that, we need those data governance projects in place. And just finally, we also know, as we know in the Pacific, AI can be used for disaster prevention and recovery. So we're also looking at how we can use AI to better empower communities with natural disasters. And we can do that by using traditional knowledge from Māori and then in partnership with AI communities. But the issue we have right now, as all of Pacific, we don't have intellectual property laws that will protect our traditional knowledge when working with artificial intelligence companies. So just in summary overall, many Māori are scared of AI, but we need to promote AI in New Zealand and in the Pacific because it is a tool that will help to empower and provide more equity for Māori and Pacific Islanders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tayuru, and give another round of applause for that interesting points related how AI could actually be leveraged for the Maori people, and you give a lot of example, for example, for the health sector as well as for the other sector on the language revitalization, and recently also you mentioned about the disaster response. So thank you for those interesting points. I would like to also later ask you some questions, especially I think it's interesting to hear how this is used by the communities, also for communities. I think that's also mentioned how we can leverage communities for different approaches that we use. So now we have heard from all the panelists about the Quintet of Capabilities. We have heard from data, digital innovation, behavioral science, as well as strategic foresight. I would like to dive a little deeper on each of the capabilities and ask more questions. But after a first round of questions, I would also invite you to ask questions from the audience here who come in person in Westin, as well as people who are watching through Zoom and YouTube. So if you have any questions, please prepare and take note of your questions, and you can ask later in the question and answer sessions or put in the chat box in the Zoom room. So I'd like to first start from the perspective of strategic foresight and behavioral science. So I would like to address the question for Pratiksha, Zainab, as well as for Caitlin. You mentioned earlier there are different examples that the countries have taken in applying strategic foresight as well as behavioral science in different countries. My question is that what are the key challenges in integrating foresight in the region for Pratiksha and Zainab? And for Caitlin, what are, from your experience, the key challenges utilizing behavioral science in addressing policy problems in the Asia and Pacific? So if you don't mind, I'll start with Pratiksha and Zainab first and then go to you, Caitlin. So Pratiksha and Zainab, who's gonna start first?
You want to start, Zainab, and then I come in after you?
Sure, works. So I think one of the biggest challenges is investment. I think to act on multiple futures requires a certain kind of diversified investment, and when public funding is limited, I think the prioritization of what to pick is often short-term and immediate. So I think long-termism is a big challenge, but also the fact that when you're constantly, I mean, in the context of the Pacific Island countries, when you're constantly in the face of climate disasters or in such close-knit relationship with climate change, it's very, very hard for you to act on long-term things because you're really sort of reacting as well. So in that sense, I think the promise, once people experience it, yeah, having given the space and having given the sort of like the systematic facilitated approach, their minds change quite a bit. But for them to continue doing that, I think funding is a challenge and definitely attention deficit, right? I'll add maybe one more thing. I think to do really good foresight work, one of our partners calls it the dream deficit. I think sometimes even to do good foresight work or to do visioning work, I think the capacity for us to imagine, I often hear that when we are younger, when you're kids, you can imagine in a more vivid way. But as we grow older, it's a muscle that we don't use much. So people's understanding of what is possible, it becomes quite limited. And there, as facilitators or practitioners, we have to constantly nudge people to be more provocative, more radical, more ambitious. Because sometimes when we look in the past, these things have actually happened. But somehow in the future, I think we can't see things that way. And also the challenge of sort of like battling dystopia. Very often, especially when we have lots of intelligent people in a room, I think a lot of our facts and the way we assimilate and analyze them, we have a tendency to say that, oh, this is not going to work. Or, oh, that's, I mean, there's a tendency to sort of like go towards something which is more dystopian. And I'm not saying essentially we want to go towards a very utopian understanding of the future either, but I think to calibrate something that's realistic and grounded in hope is sometimes a very difficult space for people to be in, especially when you're thinking of a climate trauma, climate grief, and such. So, at least, yeah, those are the few challenges that come to mind. I'm sure Pratt will have a different perspective from Misha as well.
I actually just want to add on and build on what Zainab is saying. There are just 2-3 points that I wrote down to add, which is ultimately to actually action foresight. It's one thing to look at horizon scans. It's one thing to understand what shaped the system. It's one thing to get into scenarios. It's one thing to come up with strategies. To actually action foresight requires us to actually also be systemic and to work with the complex systems that then need to be tweaked and engaged with. When you're looking at it from a government standpoint, when you're looking at it from very large institution standpoints, one of the biggest issues we still have is that within our own institutions, we're still operating in silos. And fundamentally, to action in an effective manner requires us to collaborate much more intimately and closely and to be working in tandem. And so I think this still poses a real challenge when you're looking at this from a government standpoint. You still have different ministries in multiple governments who have different levels of digital readiness or who have different levels of latitude to try different things. So that poses a challenge in a uniform stance. The other thing I think is this need to justify what we're doing and the need to justify using data. And I think this is another one that we still have to overcome because building on what Zainab was saying, it's not just about our dystopia or like this might not work. It's just getting buy-in to even try to go there. So let me just stop there. I think those two points in addition to what Zainab said hopefully offer you as an audience some insight into the challenges of integrating foresight.
Thanks so much, Pratiksha and also Zainab. I noted that some challenges include the investment. I think in terms of like thinking about long-term, people are more hesitant rather than being more reactive, which is now foresight is trying to do, right? For people to thinking for the more future-oriented rather than the short one, and the capacity that want to imagine how we can operate. The challenges is that people are still working in silo, how we can have a more systemic changes. I think that was also highlighted earlier with Jong-gun in the experience of data. And then the buy-in to actually try and experiment. So with that challenges, I would like to ask to Caitlin, do you experience the same challenges when you're trying to applying behavioral science, or are there any reflections in your experience and challenges in applying behavioral science?
Thank you, Desi. Look, absolutely, those challenges resonate, I think, in behavioral science as well. I think there are two key challenges that I'd like to highlight. The first is that behavior is complex and humans are very complicated. And often the issues that we're trying to address are also very complicated. So for example, just taking one issue around gender-based violence, for example, is an extremely complex problem which has lots of interrelated issues. And I think figuring out where to start and where to intervene can be a real challenge. So one way that behavioral science addresses this is through really doing that research and working with communities and working with people whose behaviour we're trying to change to really understand that context. So for example, if we think about something like gender-based violence, one thing that we have found is that a real challenge is say, for example, we're looking at intimate partner violence, a key challenge is around social norms, and that it might be normal for this to occur and normal to not speak out, and it's seen as a private matter. Whereas one way that we can intervene is to actually work with the people surrounding victims and survivors of gender-based violence. So rather than necessarily targeting survivors or victims themselves, can we try and target bystanders and those who are close to them? And what are the ways that we can do that? So I think really conducting that research and working with people to figure out the best ways to intervene, which might not be the ways that we initially expect or anticipate. And I think that really links to another key challenge in applying behavioural science, is that often we're asked to come up with a solution or a predetermined idea, and that might come from the way that funding requirements are set up, or it might come from the way that we're required to report. And to get funding, we might have to say straight up front, this is what we're going to do. Whereas behavioural science, we go in saying, we don't know what we're going to do. We're not sure what we're going to do. And it's really important to start with that research and let that research lead to what our intervention or what our solution is going to be. So I think that can be a key challenge. So I think sometimes it can be demonstrating the benefit of taking the time to conduct that research first, and sometimes we need to really push for that and not going in with a predetermined solution.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing the key challenges. I noted on the complexity of the behavior of human itself, because and the complexity of the issues that we are trying to touch upon with the intervention of the behavioral science, as well as the problems related to sometimes people just take upon, as you mentioned, just thinking about the solution without really understanding the process behind it. I think that's also happened a lot of other innovation and data in addition to the behavioral science. Thinking about, while experimenting, people are expecting to have a one-stop solution at the end and already have a predetermined solution, as you mentioned. So looking forward to also later explore more on how we actually can, in the process, being more iterative, for example, and thinking through all the systematic approach rather than the final solution. Thanks, Caitlin. For the next one, I would like to move my next question to Jong-gun related to data and innovation capabilities. You mentioned earlier, Jong-gun, related to the systemic partnership collaboration mechanisms that needs to be acted upon and focusing on, for example, public-private partnerships. How do you think the collaboration and these public-partner partnerships can be encouraged in your experience in the Asia and Pacific? And what roles could different actors, talking about public-private partnerships, the government, businesses, communities, play in fostering an enabling environment for data and digital innovation?
Right. Thanks. Maybe I echo, the very similar, the difficulties and the challenges the previous panelist mentions in a high level, right? So we are dealing with the different organizations with different purposes, and also the situations and change over the time. They're reflecting different parameters or the situations. You mentioned several times the future probably is multiple, and that make a lot of difficulties. The defining or establishing a partnership at a certain points. They continue the same way, same levels, the same conditions, etc., etc. So they, as an engineer or the technical people, so I want to make that complexity in a simplest way. For instance, they wanted to say something what they need or what wanted to get out of this one. And I want to implement that one's kind of, is the simplest way in a digital platform. That at least give all the organizations or participants understand each other's needs and what are their objective here, right? So for instance, as I said, as examples, probably there is an example too. The mobile operators are collaborating with the governments, okay, to understand the evacuation patterns given earthquake or the forced migration, etc. And at a time, because that instance, the mobile operators are happy to share some part of their data sets for governments that better decides where to send or distribute resources across nations or the regions. While that insight is very valuable to the governments, but still the private sectors are hard to or reluctant to provide that insight continuously or monthly basis or weekly basis because they are just so busy doing their the businesses that they are mandated to produce their revenue, while governments are seeking some collaboration with that. And for the past few years, we had several ways to collaborate with the mobile operators. Sometimes some countries are insisting the mobile operators at least give their insight given emergency situations. Some other governments are happy to buy, but only paying the processing fee, not the data sets as a price. And some other institutions are making kind of the global partnership between the big organizations and the big company, and with a goodwill, and they are collaborating. So, of course, I'm not saying none of them are useless. Rather, everything is useful. But here's, let's make everything more standardized way, and where the people are just clear enough, okay, I need this ones to sustain and to make a longer collaboration with you, probably private sectors. And if you can collaborate with us for the data innovations for revenue sharing, for instance, or the governments, if you are providing some data analysis capability, analyze your data set to produce certain levels of information. Academia, they are interested in having a new data set to analyze it, to develop some algorithm. So then, why not? So we are making kind of the clear collaboration models, and that is interpreted in a digital the platform, and everybody understand what they need, what others need, what I need. Okay. But then, by doing so, at a certain levels, a set of the collaborations established, and a situation changed. The private sectors has changed the mandates or the directions, or research institute, they changed their focus area of the research to another. They can leave. But still, we can find other partners who are happy to be a part of that initiative by saying, again, so this is what I need, and this is I can propose, but I need this one in return. So again, blockchains is one technology to make transparency and accountability and visibility to quantify some of the contributions in a certain way, and they can incentivize that mechanism by giving what they want, what others want. So I wanted to see that kind of, the collaboration models. Back to the PPP, the public and private sector partnerships. A lot so far, public sectors are leading and expecting the private sectors are helping. Why not? We are chasing that ones in different way. Private sector is leading and the public sector is supporting. But still, at the end of the day, what we want to achieve out of this one is the people's and is the communities, is the country's well-being and the health and the educations, inclusive the finance. Let's focus that ultimate goals, and let's try to find and diversify the implementation ways in different things. So that's my the reactions about that one.
Thank you so much, Jong-gun. I highlighted the ultimate goals that you mentioned, understanding actually what are the needs from different partners, giving understanding about the common goal that we would like to understand, so we can have that shared value partnerships so that collaboration can happen rather than just like a very short partnership which is not going to be sustainable. I also highlighted the importance of that transparency and accountability in those partnerships. Now, with that question, at the end, Jong-gun mentioned the importance again about the peoples in themselves. So it also leads to my next question for Dr. Tayuru in relation to the AI and then the importance for this for Maori people. So with the increase of AI, Dr. Tayuru, what can be done with new companies actually introducing AI to New Zealand? As Jong-gun earlier say, how about the private can actually giving a leading one with like supporting the public sector? So with the new companies introducing AI to the Pacific and the New Zealand, how can this be done in that area?
Sure. So in New Zealand, we're unique in terms of Indigenous peoples and our cousins up in the Pacific Highlands, where we have a number of constitutional documents that protect our rights, and our government have legislated those rights into law. So one benefit or one way to work with these new corporations would be with government assistance, with the corporations and with Māori working together under one of our constitutional documents, the Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. So that requires that the Māori and government work together for the benefits of Māori. So the way I see it is that the big conglomerates who are coming to New Zealand, if they have a social conscience, if they want to be a good corporate citizen, then they should be at the table. And several of them already are. I won't mention their names, but the big companies are already at the table with Māori in New Zealand right now. And to work together on how do we combat online violence? How do we combat racism? How do we decolonise our data? How do we empower Māori and our minorities? And at the same time, we've got a very large Pacifica population in New Zealand as well. And so we also need to be working with our Pacific cousins. So I feel that many of our opportunities and our risks in New Zealand can be applied to the rest of the Pacific. We do face many of the same issues. And as Māori, I mean, we also have, I think we have a decent part of the New Zealand economy. So there's a huge amount of Māori money that could be used in joint ventures with the conglomerates to ensure we have AI that's socially acceptable for Māori and everybody. Then I also think that there's also a bit of an emphasis on our academics. Our academic researchers need to actually research some of the potential risks and benefits of not engaging with the conglomerates and what further possibilities there are with AI and Māori in New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tayuru. It's important to highlight that there are opportunities and risks that comes with issues coming up in the New Zealand, especially for Maori people. Now, because I have asked a lot of questions, I would like to give the space for the audience to ask questions for our panelists here. So I would like to invite if there are any questions, whether from the Zoom and YouTube or from the audience coming here in Westin to our panelists. Is there any questions? I would like to open two for the first one. We have one in table 2 and we have one in table 12. So if you could share your name, organization, and to whom the question is addressed. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sri Ganesh with Learn Asia, formerly also with Pulse Lab Jakarta. Thank you for the fantastic thoughts from all the speakers. I have two questions. One is, to Pratiksha and Zainab, right? Zainab was mentioning around the issue of long-termism is very difficult when, you know, short-term priorities need to be catered to, especially when you're working in a resource-constrained environment. I was wondering, are there any examples that they could talk about where strategic thinking, the long-term thinking in, you know, those different potential futures that we can have has influenced the kind of short-term actions that you're taking for you know, immediate interventions that are required, and whether, you know, so that's another way that it could potentially come in. The second question, and I think I'll ask, that's for Caitlin. You know, I remember, like, you know, when the BIT team was starting, you know, in Tony Blair's, you know, government, you know, there is this example of where, you know, they had brought about an intervention where, you know, doctors had to respond within the first 2 days, or, you know, I don't remember the full example, right? And that was to address a particular issue of not being able to get appointments. And over time, and they gave incentives for the doctors to address those. But over time, what they found what happened was that you could no longer get long-term, you could never get an appointment next month. You had to wait for 2 days before you want to have an, you know, to try and make that appointment. So unintended consequence that happens, right? And that leads to, you know, Dr. Kairu's, you know, the point that he was making in his speech around, you know, that, you know, in one example, he was talking about, you know, Maori residents are sort of given higher priority, right? Behavior, human behavior is not consistent across time and space. And can you sort of give some examples how you deal with this challenge? Especially once a project is done, you kind of move on, and that behavior change might actually happen later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sri Ganesh, for that questions. Later, I will ask Pratiksha, Zainab, and Caitlin to address those questions. I would like now to open the next question from table 12 before the panelists answer the question. Could someone hand over the mic for the table 12? Oh, okay. Then I'll go to you afterwards.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mbak Desi. And also, thank you for all the panelists for sharing the amazing insights. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kevin. I am an undergraduate university student in my final year studying at Bogor Agricultural University, or IPB. I would like to direct this question to Caitlin. It is a wonderful example that you mentioned previously regarding working with community leaders in terms of behavioral science. Now my question is, scaling down to the practice of behavioral science in Indonesia, how do we combine the notion of behavioral science with statistics to penetrate communities that are quote-unquote resistant to changes, and also linking them to the idea of increasing inclusivity in communities? Also, another question is that, given that I am new to behavioral science, how can I get more information to study the depth of behavioral sciences? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Would you mind if we just take for the first two, and then I'll get back to you after the first answers from the panelists? Okay. Now I'll give the floor first for the first question that is addressed to Pratiksha and Zainab from Sri Ganesh, related to the long-term and short-term one, and then some examples that Sri Ganesh was asked about. So Pratiksha and Zainab.
Thanks, Desi, and thanks, Sri Ganesh, for the question. It's a really good question. And I think one example that comes to mind particularly, because I spoke about Vanuatu before, and with Vanuatu, as we were supporting this forward-looking strategy from 2022 to 2025, a lot of the things in the strategy, we realized that one of the ways to start working on that, and I think when we sort of say, I think also the way we framed it, right, was quite different in the sense that we said, let's actually get, in order to, if we want to be a country that actually, say, gives public service delivery to everyone, and that happens at the subnational local level, right? One of the ways to do that, especially if we want it to be more future ready, is to do a digital ID. And the digital ID or legal identity question in Vanuatu started out of that conversation. So it was very much something that they could do in the now, but very much looking at the future, very much preparing for the future. I think the other example that you see a lot in the Pacific Island countries is also work around risk integration. We speak a lot about DRR, and there's a lot of work around disaster risk reduction. But disaster risk reduction very often is basically outside of what planners, budgeting planning, budgeting, financing do in ministries and departments. And I think in knowing that in the long term, what is actually needed is risk integration across budgets. So you have to take climate risk and integrate it across, and that's the only way for countries to be more sustainable in the long run, rather than fully depending on climate financing or any kind of financing. I think those two examples come to mind to your question, which are both framed very much in the efforts that are needed to do now, with very much even outputs in the now, but with very long horizons of how all of that will count and make the future fairly more robust.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll just add one more example, Shignesh, to that. As you can imagine, the energy crisis is a very real one for our region, and the implications of that are quite significant across sectors. So, one of the ways in which we've seen governments really think long-term about the energy crisis, knowing that there's no perhaps immediate solution, has led to some more open-ended experimentation. And so, you can look at investments across the different renewable energy sector or portfolio in the short term as one example in which, there's been an openness to try different things, perhaps not having enough information about what will actually be successful in some spaces, but, knowing that there's a long term here that we need to continuously keep looking at different options for. And so that's where foresight is that's one space especially where also foresight is playing a role in trying to explore alternatives in the near, medium, and long term, and leading to different kinds of decisions in the immediate.
Thank you, Pratiksha, and also Zainab. Now on to the next question. There are two questions addressed to you, Caitlin.
Thank you, and thank you for those fantastic questions. I'll do my best to answer, but please let me know if I haven't quite answered your question. To the first question on unintended consequences, that reminds me of a very classic example of unintended consequences that I think came out of Israel, I believe it was, where there was a daycare and they had an issue with parents often being late to pick up their child from daycare and therefore having to stay back and leave the daycare open for longer hours. So they decided to try and charge parents if they were late for picking up their child from daycare, thinking that this would, incentivize them to get there on time. But actually they found the opposite, and parents were actually more likely to be late to pick up their child. So I think before the fee, parents really had that guilty feeling of being late and picking up their child, but the fee actually monetized that feeling, and it was quite a low fee. So rather than sort of feeling guilty, they instead felt like, I've only got to pay this small amount. It's actually not a big deal if I pick them up late. And sadly, after they removed that late fee, the effect on behaviour lasted longer, and parents were still late to pick up their child from this daycare centre. So I think there's a few things that we do in behavioural science to try and tackle unintended consequences. Firstly, when we're designing an intervention, we really carefully think through the theory of change. So why do we think this intervention will impact behaviour, and how do we think it will impact behaviour? And then setting up our evaluation and making good use of data so that we can sort of look at the steps in our theory of change and get data at each step, so that if something is not working in the way that we think it will, we can see where in the process that it's going wrong or going in a different direction. Something else that we like to do at BIT is called a pre-mortem. So rather than a post-mortem where you sort of look back at you know, what killed someone, we do a pre-mortem and we think, what might kill this intervention? what might happen, and what are all of the things that we can think of that might make this go in a different direction or not have the effects that we hope that it will. You know, of course, we can't always think of everything, but that can help us to think about what are some responses that we might see, and how can we try and mitigate against those. And then the final thing I'd say is again going back to experimentation. So how can we be testing on different scales, and how can we be iterating? So rather than designing a policy or program and rolling it out to the entire population, how can we do user testing of that first and get, you know, initial responses and feedback that we can iterate? How can we do some online testing? How can we deploy our intervention in one particular area or context and then get feedback, you know, see what impact it's having, make use of data on the impacts, so that we can iterate before we roll it out in other areas, so that we can see, you know, what is actually the response to this intervention or program. Going over to the question about resistance to change, I think, again, that really highlights the importance of really working with the people who, you know, where we're trying to implement change. And again, you know, making sure that they're involved in the process, their voice is heard, you know, which I think the different panelists have spoken about as well, that's a very important step. I think as well being flexible, so it's important for us to work with communities, but then in response to that be flexible with our approach. And again, going back to iterating, how can we change if it's not working in the way that we hope that it will. And then lastly, you know, if you're new to behavioural science, welcome. Welcome to the club. But there's, I think, a wealth of information on behavioural science. I think we're very fortunate. There's a lot of books, you know, blog posts, podcasts. I do have to pitch for the Behavioural Insights team. If you go to our website, we are very strong believers in sharing our findings. So, you know, blog posts, podcasts, there's many to choose from. So visit our website is my plug. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Now I would like to welcome the final two more questions from the audience. I already see the number 12. Is there any more questions? I see the hands on table number 8. So the first one, number 12.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Indira. Okay, hi everyone, my name is Indira and I am currently working for the ASEAN Center for Energy in the Energy Modeling and Policy Planning Department. So my question is intended to Mr. Lee and Mr. Tairu. The first question is, because I'm currently working and exploring new scenario in the low carbon economy modeling, I want to know what is the most critical aspect that we must include before we did a data projection or modeling system. And for Mr. Tairu, my question is, what is the best way to inject a new digital mindset for local communities so that we could widen our impact and also good or positivity into the community? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mbak Indira. I'll move on to the table number 8 before our panelists answering the questions. Could someone hand over the mic to the table 8? Thank you. Yang Mbak sebelah sini, Mas.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for all the knowledge that you guys have given. This has been amazing for me. My name is Jovita Warimana. I'm a human-centered designer working independently right now. And I do have a question about accounting for longevity when it comes to interventions. I think ever so often we have to work within a current system as we're making changes incrementally. However, I do wonder about the greater impact of things, of whether or not we're just allowing these interventions to keep these systems, maybe the not so good sides of these systems going, and how do you guys account for that with respect to power dynamics, different variables, even asymmetrical information, as Jung was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, I would like to give the opportunity for Jong-gun before moving to Dr. Taru.
Right. If I correctly understand your question, then you are from the ASEAN's NSA, and you wanted to do something data innovations for projecting or producing the predictions across Indonesia. What kind of elements are important to do so? Is it correct? Okay. Well, it's remind me, maybe I visited your office several times. 7 years ago to discuss the same thing. At a time we wanted to project real time or nowcast the across Indonesia, hard to identify, what kind of data sources are relevant to that context. So still, I would say, what informations and what proxy indicators are relevant to give an answer. To answer that question. But still, at the same time, Indonesia is rapidly developing over the course of years, and I expect it to continue for the next years of the time. So again, at certain points, one's the data source and one specific methodology might give you good answers to understand that snapshots. But still, that is not enough because the changes are happening, and one data source might not be enough. But you need to have a triangulating methodology that is based on the traditional method or any other big data sources. You can do that. Also, methodology-wise, let's say the AIs can be promising at a certain point, but still, when the situation changes, like the population move around, the consumption of the energy changes over the time because the people change, the society changes, and the snapshot of the society is changed. Then the algorithms and the parameters in a certain levels need to be adapted and changed again. So that again, data source need to be updated together with the algorithm and the parameters, and your triangulating methodologies to map and to understand the grounds that also need to be complemented. That's probably one of my short answers.
Thank you, Jang-gun. Now I would like to give the microphone for Dr. Taru.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so my advice and recommendations with working with local communities would be, first of all, to understand who the community is, understand their cultures, their beliefs, and to actually have an open mind. So ask what they want, what they need, what are their perceptions of the emerging technologies. Also, just to, there's a number of little cultural issues. So for New Zealand Māori, if you come into our communities and you can't pronounce our names, or if you don't know our history, we're probably not going to engage with you. But if you come in with an open mind and want to co-design, and if you want to share knowledge, that will certainly help. I also know that with Māori and our Pacifica people in New Zealand, sometimes it's easy to tell a story about what you're doing. So telling a story might involve our explorers and our ocean traveling boats and the stars when you're trying to talk about artificial intelligence or why you want to implement artificial intelligence into a local community. And also to remember that, I think most communities have their own knowledge systems there, and it might not be accepted from either a Western perspective or perhaps from your own community perspective, but just to understand that, yeah, there's multiple knowledge systems and multiple ways of explaining things. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. And the last one, I'll give the floor for Caitlin.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. And human-centered design, I think, has a lot of overlap with behavioral science. I think this is a really great question, and I think, again, highlights the importance of doing our research to in the context that we're looking at, and particularly working with the people who, whose behaviour we're trying to change, or the ultimate users of a policy or program or intervention. We've often had times where we're working with a partner. It might be on something as simple as, how can we get people to, uptake our program? We don't understand why people aren't taking up our program. We think it's great. And then it might be that we do that research, we work with people and realise that actually the program is not meeting their needs. It's not right for them, and it makes perfect sense that they're not taking up the program. So firstly, I think the importance of doing that research to really understand from their perspective. But then I think it's also important to then have the flexibility to be able to pivot and shift. So rather than having that predetermined idea of, this is what we're focusing on and this is what our solution or intervention will be, having that ability to let the research lead what happens next. So often we might identify a particular target and then realise that after we've done our research that actually we need to be focusing on something else. And having that flexibility to change our focus, to change what our sort of intervention is and where we're intervening and what we're trying to achieve to overall meet our sort of higher level goals is really important. The other thing I'd say too is it's really important to share the findings from that research. So rather than just keeping the findings to ourselves, then making sure that we're sharing that, with governments, with CSOs, with all stakeholders who are involved in the system, so that they can also benefit from these findings and use them to make changes.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thank you so much for all the audience for great questions. And before I wrap up the sessions, I really would like to give the floor, the final one, to all the panelists, maybe to give your closing remarks for maybe 1 to 2 minutes each on the highlights of today's session, if there is any reflections talking about each of the capabilities and how it could contribute in driving innovations in the Asian Pacific. So the first, I would like to give it to Jong-gun, probably.
Right. So the thanks again for making this happen. As a last remark, we've been put the citizen and the peoples within the innovations, and I would say so we are giving the authorities and the data sets to the peoples and empower them having the data sets and the lead the innovations from their ends. Probably that's one thing I wanted to highlight at the end.
Thank you so much, Jung-gun. Now move on to Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Desi. I think I would just highlight again the importance of sharing and collaborating. I think a lot of us ultimately are trying to change behaviour for good. And there's a lot that we can learn from across the world, across Asia Pacific, and it's really important for us to be sharing, what we're learning, what we're finding, and not just things that have worked, but also things that haven't worked, and what we can learn from that, and how we can apply that in other contexts. And I think that's a really key part of innovation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I would like to invite now Dr. Tyree to share your final thoughts.
I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity today, and I found it really amazing how we're all saying the same thing but in different words, and we all had the same intentions for a better world with data, with emerging technologies. So I think my final word would be, to reach out across the ocean and let's collaborate and do good for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. On the final one from Pratiksha as well as from Zainab.
I'll just say I was having the same thought, which is really we're all ending with this notion that this is a shared responsibility, and all our work really is about working with people. The future is there's no singular future, right? As we say in the field, there's only futures, and there's only really our collective futures. So I think there's a real responsibility that we have to work with people and acknowledge that. We should all have a right to contribute to what's about to unfold for all of us, and how can we, in our different practices, really make the effort to engage as many voices as possible.
It's just no. I must say that I think as innovation practitioners or practitioners working in this space, we're also the bridge between those two parts, right? Very often, even the bridge between, say, data and stories. Because people who look at data so very often look at stories as suspect and vice versa. And I think by the act of being that bridge, at least this conversation has reassured me and again revived my interest, right, in terms of how actively, intentionally am I being the bridge? And sort of really the need for community in terms of doing this work as well. So I'm very happy to be here and have had this conversation. Over back to you.
Thank you so much, Pratiksha, and also Zainab. Now I would like to welcome and ask every one of you to actually giving a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your thought with us. I highlighted that this Quintet of Capabilities are actually already existed in the Asia-Pacific region, and let's just all welcome for more partnerships and collaborations among us between the governments, businesses, private sectors, academia, as well as organizations to help us together achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So thank you again for all the audience in the Westin Jakarta Hotel, as well as who are joining online from Zoom and YouTube. Now hand over back to the MC. Thank you.
Yes, thank you again for Ms. Desi Visiana for leading the engaging panel discussion, and of course, all the panelists. Yeah, you may return to your seats. We greatly value your presence and also the participation throughout the seminar as we celebrated the decade of impact and the launch of UN Global Pulse Asia Pacific. So once again, please give a round of applause to the moderator and all the panelists. Please return to your seats. Okay, and thank you for all the participants who are present with us today in person here at Westin Hotel Jakarta, and who's been joining us online via Zoom and also YouTube. We sincerely appreciate your presence and active involvement in today's seminar. But this is not over yet. There will still be a series of agenda for today's event celebrating a decade of impact and the launch of United Nations Global Pulse Asia Pacific. After this, we will have a Service Design 101 workshop to provide a hands-on experience for development partners to apply service design methodology, good understanding on how service design works in public policy, and to advocate for the useful service design. And later on tonight, we will have the gala dinner, which is the highlight of the day. That is the launch of United Nations Global Pulse Asia Pacific with the stakeholders, partners, alumni, and UN Global Pulse Network representatives. So now I would also like to invite you all to feel free to fill the feedback form and also follow the social media at Jakarta Pulse Lab. Thank you once again. I am Aisha Fabian and bid you farewell. And let's congratulate Pulse Lab Jakarta and the launch for UN Global Pulse Asia Pacific. See you on the next event.